Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Board of Directors, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to Reentry Alliance for Louisiana's 6th Annual Conference. This conference promises to be informative, exciting, and full of strategies that can be employed to assist those who have paid their debt to society to be able to live a productive life, able to care for their loved ones and enjoy the high quality of life that we all want. We have 3 primary tracks that are designed to provide practitioners with tools and further develop their reentry strategies, to increase employment opportunities, and to address legal issues with the ultimate goal of significantly reducing returns to incarceration. Our conference presenters come to us with a wealth of experience in their related fields of expertise. You will have an opportunity to interact with them during the sessions by using the chat box. What is Reentry Alliance for Louisiana? Our primary mission is to disseminate needed information to organizations and individuals involved in reintegrating returning citizens to our communities. We further want to support regional coalitions of service providers for formerly incarcerated individuals. We encourage you to become a partner with REAL. We invite you to our website to view some of the resources available. If you have a solid program in your area or you are aware of promising practices, we invite you to share that information so that it can become a part of our clearinghouse and can be shared with others. Sign up to receive our newsletter and other information that is distributed periodically. We'd like to thank our sponsors for their generous support, and we'd also like to thank our vendors. And we ask that you take some time to visit them during the allotted periods and make a purchase or two. Lastly, we ask that you would please exercise some patience as we go through this virtual conference for the next day and a half. In the words of Thomas Paine, these are the times that try men's souls. This virtual conference is a first for us, but of course we have professionals backstage, and we are confident that you will leave the conference with a bucket full of ideas and contacts that will help you as you continue your journey. So get your paper and pen ready. And now it is my extreme pleasure to introduce our first plenary speaker, Mr. Saad Soliman. Mr. Soliman is the founding executive director of Piece by Piece Incorporated, serving Delaware. He is a subject matter expert in the specialization of reentry, evidence-based practices and implementation, as well as workforce development, supportive integrated housing, and leadership development. Mr. Soliman has been integral in the advancement of economic development policies, standard conditions policy, employment opportunities, and development related to the intersection where reentry meets economic development, family reunification, and refining recruitment for the growth of enterprise programs and models. He became the first directly impacted criminal justice involved person ever hired by the United States Attorney's Office, District of Delaware in 2011, and was the senior reentry specialist for the United States Probation Office, District of Delaware. Additionally, Mr. Soliman served as the first peer support specialist on the core team of the district's first Federal Reentry Court for the United States District Court, District of Delaware. Utilizing evidence-based modalities, Mr. Soliman has created unique and specific programming that caters directly to the needs of an expanded reentry model to include specific barriers of employment, affordable housing, and navigating a recovery landscape for adults in transition from homelessness. We ask at this time that you would welcome Mr. Soliman to our stage, and please give him your utmost attention. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy your next day and a half.
Good morning, everyone. and welcome. It's an honor to be serving on the plenary panel for the 6th Annual Reentry Alliance for Louisiana's 6th Annual Conference. As you understand, these times are incredibly challenging and incredibly different. We've all had to make modifications. We've all had to pivot. We've all had to use our own resilience to keep up with the times and serve the people that we've been working with and their families and our communities respectively. As we move forward into this presentation, I would like to just explain to you the value of events such as this. The need for collaboration at the moment is so great that if we do not collaborate and work together, we stand by watching the absolute collapse of our systemic models. The frameworks are so critical to collaborative efforts that if we do not continue to innovate ways to process how we can do our job in a better way, a more efficient way, and in a completely different way, then we will be underserving the people that we love and serve the most. So taking this time to recognize that the Louisiana Alliance has really become a leader, tip of the spear, in trying to further that education. It's an honor to be the plenary speaker this morning. So let me give you a little bit of background about myself, where I've come from, how I got to where I am. I started my journey in life with parents that weren't necessarily capable of being the best parents. You know, family cycles repeat themselves. So I ended up homeless at 8 years old. At 8 years old, homeless in the streets, I found myself struggling. Got convicted of my first felony at 11 years old. At 11 years old. And I was justice involved, serving an in and out juvenile life sentence for the next 7 years. At which point, at 17 years old, I committed an adult offense, and I was committed to the Delaware Department of Corrections for 15 years. From 17 years old until the age of 32, when I emerged in 2010 to a world that was dramatically different than the world I had left. And in addition to the world being completely different, I myself had been completely different. I had literally spent my transformative years in prison and was raised by lifers, essentially. And the value of the lessons that I was taught by those men still carry with me today and are really, truly the foundation of my organizations and collaborations and corporations, mission, vision, and values. And that is each one, teach one. So upon emerging, I ended up in the same reentry predicament that most of our participants find themselves in. Aware that I had stigmas attached and associated to me, aware that I had supervision conditions that I had to meet, and aware that through the process of growing, I would understand that my primary focus was to stay free. During that time, I was in what I would describe as survival. I had a job at a payday loan company, I had a job at a church, and I had a job as a pizza shop and working in a pizza shop. And I worked about 100 hours a week for 52 weeks. And I earned a total, my tax income statement stated that I earned a total of about $24,000 a year, working 100 hours a week. And I quickly realized that that was unsustainable, nor was it going to get me where I wanted to be. And the idea was either return back to the streets or return to something different. And so that something different became myself trying to start a company. And I started a landscaping operation, which in all honesty, I can't take credit for the success, though everyone likes to associate it with me. I went from a one-person Craigslist purchased used equipment landscaping company startup to a $2.4 million a year irrigation installation commercial firm that I would later sell for 4 times asset valuation. Simultaneously to that, I actually became a target on the radar of the United States Attorney's Office. And that wasn't a bad target. It was a target like, wow, we've got an individual in our community that's really doing very well for himself. Is there any way we can get this gentleman to teach other men in our community to do the same thing that he's done? So what occurred was very unique in the sense that I would be brought in and become the first formerly incarcerated person, the first directly impacted leader to ever be hired by the United States Department of Justice, United States Attorney's Office for the District of Delaware. Now, to whom much is given, much is expected. And by every metric, by all means, and by every perception, that metric was met many times over. I would ultimately work through the federal system, working with our federal law enforcement partners here in Delaware and our district court and our U.S. Attorney's Office to become the first peer support specialist on our district's first reentry court, which is a problem-solving court that assists men and women as they're transitioning home from federal prison in their reintegration process. We would take our federal probation office from number, I believe, 47th in the nation in metrics to number 3 in the nation. And we would reduce our unemployed, unexcused rate from 27% down to a low of 4%. How did we do that? We did that with individual learning, we did that with hands-on, and we did that with a very communitarian approach that involved every member of the probation office, including the chief, including our district judges, including our supervisors and our line officers. But most importantly, building buy-in with the participants, the guys and women that were transitioning home that were on supervised release. And so we looked at standard conditions, we looked at all the different barriers, and we identified all of the necessary things. If you're a practitioner in the field of reentry, you've heard the word risk and you've heard the word risk assessment. What validity does that information give you? It gives you direction on what kinds of interventions are required and appropriate and may be the most effective. It's not a silver bullet. But what needs to occur during that process of evaluation is the humanization of the person sitting in front of you. And that hasn't always taken place in our system. We haven't always created that space where people are people and not just case numbers and not just clients under our caseloads. And so we approached it with a communitarian model of workforce development and workforce reintegration, and our average wage went from $11 an hour to $16 an hour, and our average employment rates and retention rates all jumped up. The lateral connectivity came from every other metric being affected. Family reunification was taking place and is taking place. Employment was up, civic engagement was up, new offenses were down, violations of probation were down. And what we found was that communication between all partners was streamlined. Now, for the record, on the agenda, I'm listed as a federal probation officer. For the record, I was never a federal probation officer. I was the reentry specialist, the senior reentry specialist for the United States District Courts in the U.S. Probation Office. So in that tenure, I found myself often wondering why I could not do more. And so in and around the beginning of 2017, I realized that it was time for me to step back from the government and open up some of my own original roots. And those were the private sector. So I partnered with a wonderful lady, a social venture capitalist, a social philanthropist named Kelly DeSabatino, and she and I singularly began this journey of creating Piece by Piece, which is an organization that I am the founding executive director of here in Delaware that serves men and women in transition. And we provide comprehensive care. What does that comprehensive care look like? On the Piece by Piece side, we seek to integrate services into a daily regimen of programming that assists men and women as they're transitioning home from prison, recovery from substance use disorder, or transition from homelessness, whether it be acute, circumstantial, or chronic. We provide temporary transitional supportive housing, and that temporary means anywhere from immediate release, up to about 24 months. And we provide them with case management services, and we provide them with direct contact for workforce development programming, life skills programming, and all of the lateral supports. Now, the integration is that we've partnered with a for-profit treatment provider that provides us with the barrier reduction strategies of substance use disorder, counseling, behavioral health, mental health, IOP, individual outpatient programming, and assigns them a therapist, a counselor, and a clinician. And we create a care coordination team and a discharge planning team that work and wrap around supports around each individual. Now, this model was integrated through the needs that I identified where we had silos in our community that were not necessarily tying in. And if my community is anywhere similar to yours, you have a variety of services, but sometimes those services don't work well together. Sometimes the streamlined coordination of a continuum doesn't find itself making sense to the participant, to the end user. So what we did is we eliminated all of those silos by integrating multiple companies together. And in that process, our main priority, our vision, our primary focus was the experience of the end user such that they can accomplish all of the goals that they wanted to set for themselves. And that included, in most cases, having to talk to people about what their goals indeed were, what was realistic, what wasn't. How do you identify if there were collateral barriers that existed within legislative law that prevented individuals from accessing things that they otherwise should have rights to, such as professional licensure, such as housing, such as economic opportunity, such as credit rebuilding services. And what we found is that when you approach this holistically, it really does transform the lives of people. And so in my own professional career, I've gone from working at a cheesesteak shop, a payday loan company, and cleaning up at a church, to sitting with circuit judges, district judges, reentry professionals from all spaces, doing trainings for a variety of states from Minnesota to Arizona, all the way up to Maine, Connecticut, down to your own beautiful state of Louisiana. And one of my messages, the message that I stand to speak to the most, is Marshall Gans quoted Maimonides. Maimonides was a 12th century scholar, and he described the definition of hope in the 12th century, one that I think is the most significant and most accurate. Maimonides said, "Hope is the belief in the plausibility of the probable as opposed to the necessity of the probable or possible." Hope is the belief in the probability of the possible as opposed to resigning yourself to the probable. So in living, in applying these tenets, I often ask myself, am I living in the possible or am I living in the probable? Living in the possible removes any barrier, any restriction, any idea that you may have of what a formerly incarcerated person, someone in your reentry systems, a participant, a supervisee, what they're capable of. When you live in the possible, you are removing all of those stigmas, all of the implicit bias, all of the narrative that we have in our mind of what an individual might be capable of as they're transitioning home from prison. So I ask you to approach this conference with the idea of living in the possible, not in the probable. The probable, on the other hand, often tells us that 72% of our participants are destined to go back to jail, to prison, to incarceration. The probable also says that most likely men of color will not be able to succeed or cut into any economic system that will provide them with any subsistence that will provide their families with community reunification and empowerment. The probable also says that while we experience these challenges, we're not likely to get any help from outside of our catchment of social systems. The probable also speaks to the institutional racism and inequalities that exist within law enforcement, within financial institutions, within government systems, and sometimes indeed even within our own organizations. The probable speaks to all of the things that you are here to learn about dismantling, and further a goal of decarceration and no longer using prisons and jails and penitentiaries as solutions to social ills that were created deliberately and continue very deliberately. And so I ask you, take away all of those probabilities and what do you have? You have possibilities. You have a man before you today, and I'd like to see if there's any way we can open this to some Q&A and really have a conversation around it, because in Zoom meetings and in all of these teleconference platforms, it gets really boring and you end up putting someone on mute, or you just end up muting your microphone and handling your other tasks because life is just coming at us in such that way. I'd like to engage everyone available by saying, is there any way that we can, in chat, create a dialogue around this, and I can offer some of my insights to some specific questions. Because I went from coming directly home and having absolutely nothing to a net worth of about $4.7 million today, and an organization that serves about 700 Delawareans every year in the capacity of holistic transformative services. Now, in addition to doing that, we offer vocational trainings that include construction training that puts people in at prevailing wage jobs, living wage opportunities, starting at $15 and $17 and above, with apprenticeship opportunities. We've incorporated the business community and the respective chambers of commerce. We've incorporated partnerships with the Division of Social Services. We've incorporated partnerships with probation and parole entities, judges, court systems, the Division of Motor Vehicles, the Division of Bureau and Statistics for birth certificates, the Social Security Administration for credentialing. We've done just about everything necessary to connect all of the services for individuals. Most importantly, we've provided people with an opportunity to rebuild their credit and rebuild their lives and enter into semi-permanent and permanent housing arrangements upon completion of the program. And that's provided by us, through us, by providing lease opportunities for our men and women to get into their own homes. And at every one of our program sites, we have an approved and licensed non-custodial father and non-custodial mother visitation site to facilitate family reunification through approved systems means. Now, I'm a huge proponent of social enterprise creation, and while we're focused on creating social enterprises, we look to fund our own selves and create an ecosystem such where we're able to stand alone. Because one thing that I recognize is that when you have your hand out as an organization and you're asking an agency to fund you, that money comes with its own restrictions. And in our cases, all money is not good money. The restrictions may take you away from mission, vision, and values. The restrictions on those monies can direct you to saying things, using language that you may not necessarily endorse, but are beholden to, because the tension between budget and programming is a very real one. And so we talk about humanizing language. We talk about calling our men and women felons, convicts, ex-offenders, all of these terms that really dehumanize the man or the woman that is experiencing this challenge through this journey. And we call them formerly incarcerated people. We call them returning citizens. We call them men and women in our system that are fathers, that are sons, that are brothers, that are daughters, that are sisters, that are aunts, that are mothers, but more importantly, leaders in our community. And so as we're transitioning, we're empowering our men and women to truly feel that they can attack those negative core beliefs that society has superimposed upon them through the stigmas that we as a society have to own in order for us to change. And so I'd like to open the floor for any questions that may be as it relates to systems, as it relates to challenges, as it relates to different unique ways in which we can identify ways in which we can work together. So I am not seeing any questions. Am I engaging enough? Is it too early? Let me turn some music on. Are we having any individual questions come up at all? I'm not seeing any questions. So what I am going to get into is the need for the attendance in our conference. There have been so many planning sessions that have gone into all of the planning in this conference. And I strongly suggest that you look at every single breakout, every single session, and identify those needs within your organization and in yourself to identify that information that can provide you with solutions. So I see Mr. Holliday has asked one question a few seconds ago. How are you approaching self-funding? So self-funding is a very unique topic and one that we can get into for many, many hours. But the most important aspect of it is a series LLC. It's a model through which you can have a fundamental structure, a branch of business, and then multiple streams that come in under it. And that is social enterprise. And so if you have a mobile detailing operation that the company sponsors, if you have a vocational training where you're providing a workforce for companies that do 30, 50, $80 million a year, if you're providing auto body shop where you have income coming in, and if you're providing vocational placements for jobs and employers that need a workforce, we are able to tap into contracts and program agreements that allow us to receive monies. And a series LLC is a very specific model that allows for a variety of funding streams such that a nonprofit organization is still within the legal boundaries of its IRS designation. And understanding the money and the flow of money is very critical. And as nonprofit organizations, our traditional standpoint has been to go after grants and to go after whatever funding stream foundations may provide, or the public sector, or the county, or the state, or local parishes. But what happens is when that funding stream dries up, the program dries up with it. And it creates a disturbance of continuum of care in our communities, and that provides for a disruption. And that disruption creates distrust. And as a trauma-informed community building approach, one of the most important tenets is consistency and being able to provide a service, a reliable service that is dependable and consistent. And when you're following those funding streams that are either A, paused, or B, remodeled, or 3, discontinued altogether, you may not be able to live up to that consistency, and your community may not necessarily trust the delivery of your services beyond that point. And so we look at creating businesses. Anytime we have social enterprises or social entrepreneurs or any kind of desire to become a business owner, we immediately associate and assign them to a specific mentor in business, one that actually has been formerly incarcerated themselves and has created their own companies and has used different methods, different strategies, different barrier reduction engagements to create a successful company. And as we shadow, we begin to learn. And as we begin to learn, we begin to share in what we call the network experience. And once the network experience begins, it expands the opportunity for the reentry participant to come in and see the world from a different vantage point. I hope that answered the question. From Sandra, what was the greatest obstacle when you started and how did you go beyond? So the greatest obstacle when I started was that I was working with the United States Attorney's Office. Now, anyone that knows federal government knows that the United States Attorney's Office are prosecutors. They're the people that when you're that person that's going through the judicial system, they're the ones on the other side of the aisle telling the judge how terrible you are as a human being and why you should be given the most time and all of those things. So I was very, 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 very nervous and defensive about working with attorneys, U.S. attorneys, prosecutors. I stepped back. I stepped back from my own implicit bias. And I gave everyone an opportunity, the same opportunity that I was asking for, and that was to judge me based on myself, my character, and my actions today, not my background, not what you see on paper. And I found that they are all men and women doing a job, believing in their civic duty and in justice and in what they wanted to do for their community. And they were not a part of this great conspiracy to attack our Black and brown communities and dismantle our economic systems. They were simply prosecuting cases that were in front of them. And what I realized was that when they began to understand the lens of reentry from someone that had been through the process, they began to open their eyes to ideas and ideologies that are different than what they were taught in law school. And so we began to build friendships and relationships and break down the barriers by humanizing the process. In addition to that barrier, I also had the barriers of my background, having been considered a violent offender at conviction and having had over 47 felony convictions by the time I was 17 years old. I returned to a community with a ton of barriers. And those barriers interfered with mortgaging. Those barriers interfered with jobs, licensure. Those barriers interfered with even going places where people already knew who I was and whether or not they would allow me the opportunity to begin trying to be the man that I've now become and I'm striving to maintain. And that really made me have to go the extra mile above and beyond and approach it with compassion. Compassion for people not understanding my plight, people not understanding my journey, people not understanding my barriers. And so I internally made several accommodations so that my mind would allow me to rewrite the narrative so that I can approach it from a lens of positivity and outcomes. While I did that, I also wanted to rewrite the greater narrative of what a formerly incarcerated person or someone in reentry can become. You don't think that someone on your probation load, whatever they come into, you don't think that this man or this woman is going to be a millionaire in 4 years and employ over 3,000 people and own over 75 properties to be able to provide opportunity for men and women, or build a coalition of over 90 employers that provide living wage opportunities for thousands of reentering citizens every year. But that's the person that you're sitting before. You have to pull the greatness out of them because you have to speak life into them rather than probably. And so that was the way in which overcoming the most difficult barriers was done by me. And I found a lot of welcome within the United States Attorney's Office. I found even more welcome within the Federal Probation Office. And indeed, I found even greater welcome within our United States District Courts and our United States Appellate Circuit Courts. And our judges, with their inspiring focus on justice, did any and everything they could to remove any systemic barrier that existed for me while I was a part of the system, and indeed after. How critical was bridging the gap between you and the probation office to your program? Incredibly critical. Our program was studied by Harvard in 2015, and it was found to be incredibly effective through the communitarian model. And what is that communitarian model? It is taking the strata of chief probation officer, deputy chief probation officer, supervising probation officer, specialist probation officer, supervised releasee, workforce development, and community, and creating an asset map of how to integrate all of those resources into one effective, streamlined strategy. As you engage, you humanize, and you don't say that this is what you have to do and this is what you cannot do. What you say is, what would you like to do relative to the responsibilities that you must meet? And how can we assist you to get to where you want to be? And so the communitarian model was actually very critical in bridging that. And it really began with building specific relationships between all the probation staff and training, and providing them with insights. Every question that they had, whether it was a question that they felt was appropriate or inappropriate, it needed to be answered. The difficult conversations needed to be had. The implicit bias needed to be addressed. Further, we had to address the bias that was coming with our men and women as they were transitioning out. Because while you're coming home, you have these preconceived notions of what probation is and what it isn't, and what a probation officer is and what a probation officer isn't. And so sometimes the implicit bias of a returning citizen creates more barriers than it opens up. And as the probation system is trying to open the doors, the implicit bias of distrust, the atmosphere of poor communication or limited communication, not wanting to share too much beyond a point, created oftentimes the kinds of barriers that we would go in and really dismantle with a scalpel. It wasn't something that you can systemically apply. It wasn't something that you use a hammer for. It was the scalpel approach. It was extracting individual behaviors in individual unique circumstances such that each individual could then provide themselves the opportunity to learn and learn together. And so probation officers sometimes were the subject of that scalpel, and sometimes the returning citizens were the subject of that scalpel. And the extraction of those negative core beliefs allowed for an environment of openness that created collaboration and a sense of working together. And to that point, we talk about the lateral systems: state, federal, county, local, jurisdictional, parish, and how important it is to build bridges between those ecosystems. Our ecosystems exist in such silos that our personalities tend to determine who we're going to patronize for services or who we're going to communicate with for services. I challenge you to approach this conference with an idea of opening your network, with an idea of reframing your ideas around who you will incorporate yourself with. If it's an agency with a previously fantastic reputation, it's a no-brainer. But what about those agencies that have terrible reputations? Is there anything redeemable in them that you can find to help serve your client base? Absolutely. It just takes a little bit more digging and a little bit more leaning into conflict. And as you move forward in building those relationships to a la carte their services, you find that you can really expand and improve upon the quality of the programming that they may have. Because I don't believe, and I think we all have to approach this public sector and all of the work that we're doing, we don't believe that any agency is out there to cause harm. And so if we're predicating on that shared value, we provide ourselves an opportunity to think from a solutions-based approach rather than a problem-focused approach. And the problem-focused approach keeps us very narrow-lensed, and it keeps us focused singularly on what's wrong, and it doesn't allow us the idea of focusing on what's right. And so the Louisiana Reentry Alliance for Louisiana, REAL, is creating this space, this incredibly dynamic space for that bridging of gaps and barriers through a virtual conference that will allow us all from the very comfort of our homes to access agencies, services that we may not have been aware of, that we may not have known. Now, during COVID, we have a more important, much more global crisis to address. And that is, how do we ensure that our participants receive services and are allowed the opportunity to transition in what we ourselves as the professionals, as the systems actors, are trying to learn and navigate. So it's very important that you learn about the innovations in delivery of service and care that are going to be presented in this conference. And so I strongly encourage attendance into as many different breakouts as possible. What's some advice you can give to an ex-offender motivated to participate in a reentry program that is not necessarily a condition of their parole? So I would do away with the language ex-offender. Firstly, I would humanize the component. And I would say, what would some advice you can give to a returning citizen or a motivated participant? And that advice I would give is do any and everything that you can to identify as many resources that are available for you, because the resources that we have are vast. But making those resources available for the men and women that are transitioning home is very, very, very difficult. We ourselves as practitioners have to expand our lens of catchment in order to understand where the resources are and where they come from and how to access them without violating any of the criteria or conditions of approval. And so explaining to them that they should walk into a desirable situation looking for as many resources as possible. Because one thing for me that I don't know if this is pretty true with everybody here, but if you think about it, we're all more alike than different. One thing that I can honestly tell you is that the best things in my life that occurred, I never really sought out. Those were the things that were given to me in opportunity by myself being put in a position, or putting myself in a position that allowed for the good to overcome the bad, that allowed for the transformation of my life to take place with systems, because the systems want to be able to say that we've helped Saad Soliman, that we've helped Tyrone Williams, that we've helped an Adam Kramer, that we've helped a Jaleesa, that we've helped whomsoever. The systems want to be able to say that. So we, as probation officers in systems, can tell our participants, while it's not a condition of your supervised release, while it's not a condition of your supervised release, it is better for you to jump into this program because the access of resources and the commitments that are there on behalf of the court, the probation, the systems are there to provide you with resources that you may not be aware of. And so it's always something that I would suggest involvement in. And it's like extracurricular activities. If you're talking to them, related to their children in their schools, how you build a dossier that'll get you a good college application so that you can get into that HBCU or that next university or community college or educational institution of higher learning. And you say, do all of these extra things to get into that position that you're really going to love. It's the same exact thing when you're talking to men and women on supervised release under condition. Do any and everything you can. One piece of advice that I received from a counselor who I'd met when I first went in, she was a correctional officer, and she would continue her education. And through the process of my 15-year sentence, she went from a regular correctional officer to a corporal, to a sergeant, to a lieutenant, at which point she became a therapeutic counselor. And on my transition out, 15 years later, I saw her in one of the halfway house work release transitional facilities that I was placed in. And I said, hey, and she said, hey, and we hugged, and she came up to me and said, I'm so proud of you. And I said, yeah, I'm so proud of me. I've finished 15 years. Now I'm scared to death about probation because I know everyone wants to violate probation and send me right back to jail. Give me the best piece of advice that you can give me as I'm transitioning out. And she said, okay, Saad, I'm going to tell you, don't let your probation officer find out anything. Okay. What's that advice mean? It really confused me because I didn't have any context. And I'm like, that sounds deceptive. That sounds like it's going to get me in trouble. And she said, no. I'm telling you, don't let your probation officer find out anything. Tell them everything. So I had to sit back. And I had to understand what that really indeed meant. And it meant that you were building such a trust relationship with your probation officer that you told them everything that occurred before they found out. It's like a parent when your child comes home from school and you say, hey, how are you? How was school today? Dad, school was great. Okay. An hour later, I get a call from the principal. Your son was in a fight. Well, didn't you just tell me a minute ago that everything was great? Why didn't you take the opportunity to tell me that you were in a fight? Now I'm angry because I had to find out from someone else. It's similar in the sense that probation officers do not want to find out from other people things about their participants because the caseload themselves, the people under supervision, should tell them everything and build that trust relationship and get ahead of the conflict. And so as it relates to that, it builds a trust environment. Now, the responsibility on the probation side is that the officer has to make space, has to create an environment for safe communication, such that it's not an immediate accountability, immediate consequence, immediate punishment response through a controlled compliance model, but one that allows for the rewriting of the narrative and the growth of an individual that's being vulnerable and being truthful and transparent. And so our job is to engage that space in such a way that it feels safe for everyone to work in. And what are the steps to changing the mindset of men and women transitioning home from prison? The steps begin with trust building. The steps begin with them believing truly that you are there. Excuse me one second. I have a RoboVac that was about to start running on its automatic pattern. And sometimes life just happens just like that. So you have to create a trust environment in which individuals truly believe that you're there to help them and not to hurt them. A second step is attitude. The term attitude really describes a human's disposition and the way that they think about things. If you're driving for an interview, and this is the biggest job interview of your life, and you've got $150,000 more than what you're making right now offered to you on the table, provided that you're there on time, and you're driving and you're running a little bit late and you're behind a vehicle that's going 15 miles under the speed limit in a single lane, how are you feeling? Frustrated, nervous, angry, any of a range of emotions, because this person is going to make you late for the opportunity of a lifetime. This person is driving 15 miles under the speed limit, and you're just the tension, the anxiety, the pressure starts to build up within you. Transform that exact moment and consider that you knew that the person in front of you was your great-grandmother on her way to her physical appointment with a doctor. How do you feel? A lot calmer, a lot more at peace, a lot more focused on the safety and the care of your great-grandmother who's driving in front of you. And you almost feel like the caregiver behind her. That changes the attitude. It rewrites the narrative. It changes the lens. How we view the world is exactly how we experience it. It doesn't mean that the world is going to change. It doesn't mean that the people are going to be nice. It doesn't mean that the world beyond us is going to provide us with any opportunity. All it simply means is that we're going to approach it with a lens of kindness, and that we're going to approach it with a lens of being open. We're going to understand that through the process of growing in this new world, there are going to be exciting opportunities that we're not going to be able to access, and that is fine. And we're going to remove in our minds the should-haves that will hold us, the could-haves that imprison us, and the would-haves that make us feel too incapable of doing things differently. And so those negative core beliefs tend to be this process of really destroying the internal core, and it's reinforced by the negative messages that we have outside. So if you teach your participants how to build their internal knowledge of self and create that internal atmosphere of care and kindness, they're more likely to succeed because they take that singular attitudinal change and they apply it across the board to every single circumstance that they encounter. You think most parole probation officers are willing to work with ex-offenders to help them become successful? I think most probation parole officers get into the space because they do want to combine social work and law enforcement together. I think that our systems have made the law enforcement piece a little bit more concentrated than the social work piece, in the sense that we in our systems have probation officers that are simply public safety vehicles, supervision vehicles, extensions of a court order, extensions of a community public safety engagement, extensions of a Department of Corrections supervised term of release. With systems being transformed, if probation officers begin to consider themselves as change agents, and yes, maintain the law enforcement authority, and yes, maintain the social work mentality, but utilize that singular approach that they are change agents with all of these other domains as tools, then yes, they can be the most effective. But the willingness to work with men and women that are transitioning home to become successful, I would really challenge the leadership of any agency that employs officers that are unwilling, because they are part of the problem, not a part of the solution. And if we're operating from a solutions-based environment, we need to recognize that training will provide people with the ways in which they can engage in a helpful manner. And if we find an individual that's unwilling, I would suggest that person be looking at other careers, because there's a bunch of opportunities in this world, the entire big bouncing globe that we live on, for other people to make money rather than being in the way of men and women that are transitioning home because they are unwilling to focus on what they need for the participants in their program. And that's a very cold and very real reality, one in which we as systems leaders need to identify and root out. It's like a root canal. There's a tooth, there's a cavity, and it's gotten so far down that you have to either crown it or remove it. It's what happens. Sometimes relationships come up to expiration dates. And in this case, the relationship between the organization and the probation officer, due to their unwillingness, has made that expiration date come. And it's hard for us as systems to identify individuals But once we do, it's our moral and ethical obligation to stick to our core mission, vision, and values, and that is the recreation of a new life for men and women that are transitioning home so that we can benefit economic development, public safety, family reunification, community development, and wealth creation opportunities. More often than not, I think the case is not that there's an unwillingness, rather than there is just simply not knowing. And if we inform and train and provide the resource development similar to what the Reentry Alliance's conference is doing here, I think we'll find that there may be change within the way that officers engage their probationers, because the opportunity is maybe not to take them away, but certainly to inform and better resource them. So now I'm coming into the last 5 minutes of my presentation here, and I hope that I wasn't so boring that everyone's asleep. I do see that the participants here are coming in. Numbers are great. It's looking like we've got 88 people so far involved, and I want to thank everyone, and I am going to type my email address into the chat so that anyone here can just have it. And feel free to reach out to me for any kind of conversations, any kind of follow-ups, any kind of need as it relates to the transition. But one thing that I would certainly encourage in these very difficult times that we're navigating is that you focus on the systems. Feel free to join us for the networking hour and play chat roulette. Ooh, that sounds like fun. I may. I'll do my very best to get there. In these challenging times, it's your focus, it's our focus as a system to maintain our structure, to maintain our integrity, and to create disaster plans and pandemic plans and emergency plans such that the next time we experience this kind of a situation, and I am of the belief that we will, because mankind, history teaches us that we experience things in cycles. And as we're planning through this process, use the COVID-related protocols that are created for disaster planning, for any kind of outbreak planning, for natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, for grid crashes, electric outages, an overwhelming general population infected with the regular flu, an increased engagement with, I see we have Gloria Winchester of AmeriHealth Caritas of Louisiana. I work very closely with AmeriHealth of Delaware, AmeriHealth Caritas of Delaware. Create systems where people can access primary care through their MCO. Create opportunities of connectivity such that individuals are able to have access to and not necessarily be just simply only accessed because of a pandemic. Continue the very valuable work in an entirely different domain, this public health domain. Continue that work and incorporate it into our work in barrier reduction, collateral consequences, decarceration, disrupting schools to prisons, foster care to prisons, alternative schools to prisons pipelines. Disrupt all of those, while you're also focusing on judicial, legislative, and local change. You will recognize that while all of those things are taking place, we can now focus on incorporating healthcare and the need for connecting healthcare services to those in our community that are transitioning out. So I appreciate everyone's participation in this conference. I appreciate all that you bring to the table. I suggest that everyone be as engaged as possible. Use the chat, communicate with your partners, your colleagues, your friends, your community. We comprise all of what we are. And I leave you with one final piece. Marshall Gans quoted Maimonides, and he said specifically, hope is the belief in the plausibility of the probable, as opposed to the resignation of the possible. Live in the possible. I think I screwed that up, actually. Hope is the belief in, in the plausibility, in the belief in the possible. Living in the possible is much, much, much greater of a space than living in the probable. Do not resign yourself to the probable. Thank you. And may this conference be incredible for all of you. Have a wonderful day.